We're going to convene the, what's the date today? The December 19th Environmental Matters Committee meeting. All members are present and accounted for. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda.
Move approval of the agenda.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Approval passes. Next up, we have approval of minutes.
Move approval of the minutes.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, minutes are approved. And then appointments. First up, all right, we have how many appointments? 2 appointments. I'd like to invite Mr. Kurt Riegel up to the table here. And Jim Burdick, why don't we do both at once here? This is for the same commission. So these are 2 appointments for reappointments for both of them to the Severn River Commission. And for my colleagues' sake, this is not a commission that is in our code. It's a commission that is set up by the state, if I'm not mistaken.
It's a county commission.
County commission.
But there are 2 representatives on
Right.
the commission from the city.
Right. And so how long have both of you been on the commission?
I've had 2 terms already, so this would be my 3rd on the commission. And
Terms are 3 years? Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is my 5th year. I had 1 commission, and the previous administration wasn't active in re-upping. So I've been about 5 years.
Okay.
So 1 2/3.
Can you explain a little bit for everybody here the role of the Severn River Commission?
Sure. It's unusual in the state. It was created by the county government, and there is some state representation ex officio. But the purpose of it really is to take care of the Severn River watershed. The Severn River is designated as an historic river in the state of Maryland. And although the scope is broad, in recent years, the interest of the commission has focused very much on environmental quality, water quality, and preservation of forests, and everything connected to the health of the watershed. So that's where the emphasis is now, and that's where my personal interest is.
And if I might add, it's not an enforcement agency. It's pretty much a watchdog agency. So we're lookout for things that come up. We review the Army Corps of Engineers permitting process. We review the city's permitting process. We take a look at where we can inject ourselves to give advice to city council, the mayor, and of course county council and the county exec.
Good, and I think underneath we have 2 administrations who are very supportive, and hopefully that'll make it even more productive and enjoyable for everybody. I want to thank both of you for years of service on the commission. I want to open it up. Anybody else have questions for these 2?
You would have thought they'd have learned by now, but they're still volunteering.
Some of us learn very slowly.
I would strongly support reappointment of both persons, and I appreciate the work you're doing, and I appreciate the Severn River, historic or not.
Alderwoman?
I just was going to take advantage of your knowledge and ask you right now what you feel are the most, the largest environmental threats to the Severn River today.
Yeah, I want to start on the positive side instead of the threats. One of the things that we've been involved with
Okay.
very deeply is the yeah, what do I think of? The no discharge zone, excuse me. A lot of ink has been spread about all the people that got involved, but the actual no discharge zone initiative started with the Severn River Commission. And we started looking around and got a hold of David Barker's and so on and so forth. So, in my opinion, the biggest threats is really upland control of stormwater, as well as sewage effluent coming in from
Yeah.
sources that are
Well, that's
both private
timely.
and public.
That's what we're discussing today.
Yeah, those are the two I've got. What do you think?
Well, you took some of the words right out of my mouth. Yes, I think the no discharge zone is a very important thing in the following sense. And it began with the Annapolis Environmental Commission. I sort of started that ball rolling and then carried it to the SRC, and both were enthusiastic, both moved it forward. And it moved, much to my surprise, from a city-only interest to a county-wide interest, and that's where it stands now. I think we have a challenge before us. There are indications of support both from the city council and the county council for the no discharge zone application. But what we need and will be recommending is that both governments formalize their support of this in the application process, and of course for the long term with a commitment to support those activities that are only the government's.
Thank you. I believe there's a motion on the floor, so I'd like to second that motion. Am I correct?
Sure.
Yes, second.
Any further discussion? I would also just like to say, you're welcome back to this committee anytime. If you have any kind of reports you want to give to us or anything we can help with on the council, so anytime.
And thank you. I understand you are going to be the city's ex officio member of the Severn River Commission yourself.
Yes.
That's a welcome step forward. There has been nobody from the city in that role for some years.
Yeah, we have DNR ex officio, we've got state delegate ex officio, and I think the former chairman is allowed to be an ex officio. So this would be great to have.
Who's the state delegate?
Right now it's Malone, I believe.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Good.
Aye.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, aye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, congratulations and thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you so much. I didn't want that to sound like a quiz. I was just curious.
All right, I forgot, I was about to say I forgot to invite Pete, but he's way ahead of me. Come on up, Pete. Sorry, Director Gould from Planning and Zoning.
Working.
So are we doing resolution 4618?
Did I skip something?
That's the stormwater.
ID 324-18, Planning and Zoning update.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
Groundhog Day, Pete.
Good afternoon, yes. Mr. Tierney, this will be slightly different because this will be plans associated with forest conservation. So again, you see the worksheet, and I'll just highlight any changes that are associated with property, developments associated with forest conservation. But if you have other questions, I'm more than willing to answer any questions or comments you may have. Probably the first update I have would be town courts, I believe. I'm sorry, Central Park, we'll start
Yeah,
there.
is anything going on there?
Yeah. Tonight,
Yes.
be there or be square. That plan will be going to the planning commission tonight for its public hearing. I don't know what, unless you have specific questions, that's an afforestation project for the most part. And we've approved it, at least preliminary. The preliminary forest conservation plan has been approved. The other update would be.
Pete, I did have a question about the Central Park. And thank you, I did get some responses to some of my questions about what trees were getting protected, and it sounded like the plan may have changed a little bit, the approved forest conservation plan.
Yeah, I saw the comments too. There's always tweaking that's always done, going back and forth when they do their final submission based on staff comments. So yeah, there seemed to be some adjustments. We had some issues originally with the location of the bike or the pathway through the property, so they were adjusting that. But other than that, it's still 45 townhouses, and the central idea, if you have specific things.
30-inch Magnolia, is that,
Well, that's the one that I heard back from Tom Smith, and he said they tried to, but then they ended up shifting the units to protect 2 other trees, sounds like.
A couple of other trees because of where the utilities had to go and stormwater management facilities and that, it just seemed that could not be saved if, based on what they were trying to do from a design concept. And, I mean, Tom can better explain that than I could, because I wasn't in the weeds on that, so to speak. But I think, he tried, I think he was answering your questions as best he could in terms of what you had concerns about. But yeah, it seemed like that tree was not going to be saved because of, they saw far better benefits through the design process to save more trees and let that one go, so.
Yeah, that's what it looked like. I asked because it looked like the 2 new ones to be saved were originally called to be removed in the approved
Right.
forest conservation plan, so.
just put that on Jim Conlon's checklist.
There we go.
So the other one, I think, was Town Courts, which was approved, I'm trying to find it, but, yeah, that was approved, that's not shown, but that was approved at the end of November, shortly after the new, forest conservation bill was passed. So right now, in terms of properties that will be evaluated under the new plan, obviously, we're waiting on Parole Place. Under the new legislation, which is a lot of questions, people have Parole Place and Village of Providence Point, off the top of my head. Those are the 2 major developments that will be.
Where's Rocky Gorge? I just rode by there today to look at that scar where all the trees are gone, and, they mowed the trees down, and now it's just sitting there fallow.
Right. So they have been issued all of their grading permits, finally. The second grading permit, as you know, they went through that lengthy process of trying to access Ayers Allen.
Right.
They moved forward under the old plan with their grading permits and finally got that issued just a couple of months ago, I want to say. Matt might know about Ayers Allen?
End of
August.
August.
Oh, yeah, I guess I could look here. End of August. So they are in discussions about another possibility of accessing Vineyard Road. They've been into us to discuss that, but
God, if they can get the Vineyard Road, then why couldn't we have done the bypass road? Don't
Access,
they have to go through all the same ravines and environmentally
they're
sensitive?
trying to get access to Vineyard Road? That's
Yeah.
the next one to the northwest, I guess, right?
yes.
Yeah.
I don't know, and
That's
it's,
yeah, there
it's
is
a
a
question.
huge ravine there.
It's a question.
Access to
Yes.
Ayers Allen
What?
is state highway, and it's really close to the intersection, almost too close for that to really work.
Yeah, I would think so. It's the same issues as to going onto RSTL and further down, I think could even be worse. Is that, what comes in there? Is that Route 2 that comes in onto RSTL and right before
Yeah.
Vineyard?
Yes.
I think that would be, the whole point of this is to not get people killed in automobile accidents.
Well,
I-
yeah.
It's conceptual at this point in time, so I think they're exploring their due processes for this, and that's why you haven't, and my point to all this is I think that's why you haven't seen any movement on that at this point in time in terms of construction, because they are,
Well, the good news there is that's where Fred Delavan and his wife live, so we'll see how they like development in their neighborhood.
At 5 PM in the afternoon.
Yeah, right.
so unless you got other questions, I know.
So what about South Annapolis Yachting Center? Where are we on that?
We're through, off the top of my head, they are going for building permits or have been issued for a couple of the homes. And I think they've gotten their grading permit.
Okay, so are they still fighting the lawsuit on the water side of things?
Oh, the Port Warden's project? Yes, that's in court.
Yeah, okay. And what is the threshold? If you have 10 or more units, you have to do MPDUs? So they're
More than
doing-
10, yeah.
So do they have more than 10?
No, they have 9, I believe,
So-
but they're also existing units.
Okay,
that-
so it says NA here. All right,
Right.
never mind. They're not doing, I was gonna say,
Right.
MPDUs in $3 million home neighborhood, that'd be interesting. All right, thank you.
What Annapolis?
Just one
Yeah,
other,
Right.
it looks like, I think I saw in the paper, Village of Providence Point has a public,
Hearing.
sorry, community meeting, right?
Meeting, right.
I guess this is gonna be one of the first community meetings, on, January 3rd, is it?
Correct.
So it's coming, that's kind of bad timing, but Teresa said that it wasn't up to the city, I mean, with all the holidays and whatnot.
So they
Um,
wanted to do it, in between the holidays, and we said no.
Well, thank you.
So, they pushed it to the 3rd.
Okay.
We really don't have, there's no code requirements. Remember,
Yeah.
if Ross remembers with Joe, we talked about dates and times, and should we restrict it, because is a Saturday better than a weekday? We didn't, I think we decided not to go that far with the legislation at that time. So, to pick the date and time, but we did say before the it had to be 14 days, because they wanted to submit, and we're like, you gotta do your community input meeting. This is a whole new application. So, yeah, they wanted to do it like today or tomorrow, or I forget when it was, and we're like, you need to wait till after the holidays, so we did make them do that much, so.
Okay.
Or twisted their arms, as
Yeah.
so. But there's nothing in code to say they couldn't
Yeah.
have, so.
Yeah, well, thank you again. And, so does that mean, when do you think they're gonna submit their preliminary?
I
course-
think, the way they're talking, 14 days after that meeting, they're gonna,
Okay, so
they're
moving
ready to
forward.
roll.
Okay.
Depending upon what comes out of the community meeting, I guess, because that's the whole
Okay.
idea of making them wait. So they at least
15,
consider
yeah.
what the community has said to them.
Right,
Again, I'm looking over at Alderman Arnett, who said we need to give, they can't just submit the next day.
So how did they formalize the community meeting, the comments? I mean, how does that work?
They have to do a summary and discuss it as part of their application as
Okay.
to whether they address the comment or not address the comment. That is in the new,
Yep, okay.
code.
So it goes back to you.
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
submit those written comments and responses to me, as part of their application.
Where are they gonna hold the meeting?
it's at St. Martin's,
Okay,
or Andrew, is Andrews?
I can't remember.
Sorry, I'm blanking on.
You know,
No.
that raises an interesting question. So there won't be a video record of the meeting?
I don't think so, no, there has to be a meeting summary that has to be submitted of what occurred at the meeting. And then we gave, if anybody disagrees with on that summary, they have so much time to
Right.
note that objection of what's in the meeting summary. If you recall in the code that you drafted.
Yeah, no, but I wonder, I mean, I hear so often, and certainly you can guess what some of those projects are about. Well, they promised to do all of this stormwater mediation or mitigation, and I'm saying, well, I don't see it in writing anywhere. Well, they promised it at the meeting, and I'm saying, well, how do you get that recorded? You know, if promises were made,
Right,
and then
so
there's,
if that yeah, that would be something I would think should come out of this process. You know, if it's a community input meeting, and the question was asked, and there should be a response to it
yeah.
as part of the summary. But, the casual meetings that they had and the outreaches that they did, there is no record of them.
Right.
So there should be a record of it, and there's an objection to that record, it has to be duly noted.
All right, well, it'll be interesting to see how this works. We may have to go back to the drawing boards.
All right,
Thank you.
any other questions for Director Gottwald?
Happy
All right,
holidays.
thank you for stopping
Happy
by.
holidays to you.
Yeah, and
Happy
you're getting
holidays.
Monday off? Wow.
I'll be here tonight.
Yeah, so will I.
Just point of order, do you need me here for the no net loss
No,
Fee?
I don't think so.
Okay.
No. You're welcome to stay.
Yeah, yeah, right. Run away, run away.
All right, next up, we do have R4618, stormwater regulations. I'd like to invite Mr. Waters up, our stormwater engineer. And for my colleagues, Director Gerald is out of town. And, and Ms. Hodo, I don't know if, you can come up in case you want to say anything to this as well. But Ms. Hodo's here, Jackie Gild is also unavailable. So with that said, I do want to also say, let's keep in mind, Matt is the technical engineer, stormwater engineer, and so I don't want to pepper him with policy questions, which are not his decision to make. So with that in mind, so let me also get started with a few things. I think, does everybody have my revised proposal amendment?
Is it in, unless
I
it's,
emailed it to you. I haven't put it in
Oh.
the system yet.
okay, well,
where you had the revised percentages.
Yeah. I can walk through that a little bit.
well,
I
can we
also
go,
have-
can we go back to first principles though, because
Sure, yeah.
what I have been hearing on a lot of things elsewhere, like on APF for traffic, or no, here's a better example, on moderately priced dwelling units, I have got legislation that says change shall get a 20% bonus to may get. And Director Gottwald came back, I think appropriately enough, and said, well, now that you're making that discretionary, you have to give me standards upon which to base my discretion, which we've actually, I think, come up with a good solution. We're taking things out of the language for getting a variance, and Pete seems to be happy with that. I'm happy with that. What I heard from the city manager on this is that when we make it discretionary, well, first of all, Director Gerald made it very clear he was uncomfortable with discretion. But if we do make it discretionary, do we have a set of standards or criteria, guidelines, whatever you want to call it, that would give them a basis for saying, code says the minimum is this, but given the circumstances you have on your property, we expect more, because you can do it with relative ease, you can do it with relatively little additional expense, whatever. So that's the part that, for me, I think we may not have yet come to grips with. Ellie, I think I was talking with you about this. Making it, I'm not interested in changing the code and making it hardwired, because I think this is something that should be discretionary. So if we change it from 50% to 100%, or 100% to 150, and I took Tom Baum's testimony to heart. On his project on Inner West Street, he barely could make 50%. So if we required him to do 100%, he basically couldn't do the project. So, but on other projects, say just picking it out of the air, the Eastport Shopping Center, I think they can do more than 50%. And we should ask them to do more than 50%. But then what does David or Matt say? Well, we want you to do 67.5%. How do they base that decision? So I'm not feeling, I did see your amendment, I didn't have it with me, but I'm not sure we've given them what I think I've heard Teresa and David Gerald say they want, which is, if it's more than the minimum, how do I decide how much more, and what do I base that decision on?
Oh, yeah, Don, just to
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with your assessment, Alderman Arnett, and I think what I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that opens up the door to a liability issue if you go to one development and ask them to exceed, and go to another development and you don't ask them to exceed. So you get into this gray area. So that non-numerical window of evaluation is just something we don't have a handle on. And I don't know if that's fair or not. I don't know if it's a fair assessment of the current practice. I've heard comments of not doing enough and all that, and so I agree. I think that's the genesis of this legislation, is to do more.
Well, and it's more than just do more, it's do more because whatever the developer doesn't do, we, the taxpayers, have to do.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's,
I just want to expand on that.
No.
I think I got hit with a wealth of information at our work session when I realized how much limited opportunity we have to address the stormwater issues and the current projects that we have. So the urgency of this it's unfortunate that it lies on the developers, but we've gotten ourselves into this position.
and I just want to chime in, I guess, back up a little bit, just to reiterate that the intention with this resolution was just something kind of quick, utilizing our existing code instead of just overhauling the entire code, which I do want to do some code, looking at redoing some of the portions of the code with Public Works, but that's a much lengthier process, theoretically, anyway. So that was simply the idea, because in the code, and I give you a copy of this, it's sections of the code, stormwater code, and so just to point out some of the basics. So this is from 1710-080 A3, and you've got, this is Director of Public Works may require more than the minimum control requirements specified in this section. And this is kind of where the criteria that Alderman Arnett mentioned, if hydraulic or topographic conditions warrant, or flooding, stream channel erosion, or water quality problems exist downstream from a proposed project. And this comes directly, correct me if I'm wrong, this comes directly from the state statute, believe.
Yeah, that's correct. And the reason for the language of that was originally put in the state code was, it kind of goes along with outfall statements, making sure that the outfall is stable, the ultimate outfall from a site, and that's where that language comes from.
And so I'd also like to point out, if you look at B2, it talks about, this is the second highlighted area.
Right.
It mentions, let's see, stormwater management plan. And essentially, and this is what I was trying to get at last time, and I think one reason why I'm trying to change the language is that, and again, I want to check this with Mr. Waters, but it seems like they do kind of have, it's not just about treatment per se, where my original language, and I do have found a, Takia, can you get this to me? So it seems like they've kind of two options, not necessarily about treatment. It says where site conditions prevent the reduction of impervious. So basically they can reduce impervious surface by 50% or 100%, whatever the requirement is. So reduce the impervious surface or provide for qualitative controls. So it says there can also be a combination of impervious area reduction and stormwater practice implementation under the law. So it's not just about the ESD practices necessarily, right? You can do the...
Yeah, that's correct. So the way the redevelopment state code is written, or in the stormwater management manual, the way it's written is the first options are you can do 50% reduction of the existing impervious area within the limited disturbance. of the construction site. Or you do ESD practices,
What's
The
ESD?
environmental site design,
Okay, thank you.
which is the small scale practices that what we're required to do now.
Like the rain gardens and the
Yeah.
kind of thing.
To do that for 50% of the existing impervious area within the limited disturbance for a 1-inch storm, or a combination of impervious reduction and that 50%. So if you were to, for instance, if you were to reduce, say, 25% of the existing impervious area within your limited disturbance, then you'd only be required to treat 25% of the impervious area with ESD practices.
Right.
And if you increase the impervious area within the limited disturbance, you're required to treat stormwater management at 100% impervious for that new development. So if it's a net increase, let's say, you're increasing it by, let's say, 1 acre. For that 1 acre, you're gonna have to treat 100% of that impervious area at what the rainfall intensity is for that soil type.
Yeah, and so I think what I highlighted this just to kind of make it clear, the distinction between the treatment and the reduction of impervious surfaces, which I think that kind of gives the developers a bit of a option, in the sense that if they, but also related to that, though, if you turn it over, the other highlighted sections have to deal with the variance process. So there is a process for, and it even says it, number 3 at the top, the director or his agent may waive the requirements of this section, essentially, if hydrologic or hydraulic design conditions prevent impervious area reduction or on-site stormwater management. So they already do the process. If, so for example, if something in the historic district has a problem, small site, they can apply for this variance. So I think there's already that kind of process built in, but I do like the idea of kind of raising the standard, the minimum, in at least to a certain degree.
So you want an ordinance then?
Well, that's the thing. Ultimately, I think we need to look at that, but I think at this point, I guess it's not necessarily about raising the minimum, but it's about how do we encourage Public Works to treat more than, to require more than the minimum when these circumstances, when we're faced by these circumstances. I mean, the one example we've encountered most recently is the Central Park project, which, you know, and thank you for the answers, Mr. Waters.
Do we have those? Did we see Matt's answers?
No, it was just
Okay,
something I
I'd
sent to him
like
at
to
lunch
see that.
today.
Okay.
But my question had to do with how much they were treating on the site, and essentially that site's being treated as new development, from what I recall, because of their.
Not completely. So
Okay.
it's treated as a redevelopment project, but they treat it more impervious it's kind of a complicated situation. So it's one of those situations where they are increasing the net impervious for the site. So initially, I believe it was 41% impervious, and they're increasing, I think, to 42% impervious. But with all the ESD practices that they installed, they couldn't meet the stormwater management requirement through ESD practices, so they had to do a pond or an old structural design, which with that structural design being installed in there, that pushed them up above what was originally required.
So that's where the code worked in having that, instead of asking for a waiver or something,
Right, and
yeah.
in that situation too, with that review, we would not have granted a waiver in that situation, because they had space to do more stormwater management on there.
And you made the call to do that?
Yes, yeah, I mean, we told them, we went through multiple times and making sure that the computation's done correctly, because they weren't properly sizing that structural practice. There's a whole guidance document from MDE that goes through how you size your stormwater management practices properly, and in situations when you can't meet your environmental site design volume requirements, you have to figure out the equivalent volume that needs to be treated in a structural practice.
What is the hierarchy of those, what's the hierarchy of those requirements? Is MDE govern over, or best management practices are?
So what the state wants us to
Footnote with you
do,
there, yeah.
for stormwater management is do the ESD practices as your main treatment
Yeah.
method.
Yeah.
And the reason we use those is
Okay.
because they're smaller practices, they're closer to the source of the runoff, and so they treat it closer to the runoff. The reason I think that the state is pushing us towards using them more with the most recent stormwater management law, which is the Stormwater Management Act of 2007, was because the large-scale practices over time have more maintenance issues. And like in my background, I worked for a consultant firm before I came here, and a lot of the work I did was inspecting state highway administrations, BMPs, which are best management practices, which is the old school structural practices. And the number of issues that they had out there and the cost to fix them is pretty big, you know, and that's why we kind of shifted more to the small, local treatment practices. So they want us to use the ESD practices first. And if you can't meet your goals with that, you have to do a structural practice to meet the rest of the goals then. And you have to do an additional equation, which is the equivalent volume equation that kind of figures out how to simulate what's called woods in good condition for like a model of how the runoff runs through the site.
So who makes the decision, per the code, that the ESD is not quote-unquote practical, and that, that's sort of a critical decision, who makes that decision? Like,
I mean, that's
Or
up
is
to
that-
the designers, if
it
that's
is-
how they want to
okay.
do. I mean,
Practical meaning what, like cost-wise, or structurally, or impact,
Oh,
or?
okay, hang on, let me back up and
Sorry.
make sure I get this clarified. So when you do environmental site design to the maximum extent practical, is that what you're referring to?
Well, what I'm concerned about is that specifically in 4.f, a partial waiver of the treatment requirements, this is addressing the waiver.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I just want to know when that kicks in, when you say is not practical,
So,
you know what I mean?
That's a bit of that's a bit of something else though, because 4F we can get into, but in terms of the waivers that the Public Works Director, is that what you're?
Well, okay, yeah, generally speaking, I guess it's the same question, is who makes that decision on
so if
practicality and,
let's say you were doing a project and
Yeah.
you did everything on your project that you possibly could.
who am I? Am I the
You're
developer?
the owner or the developer.
Okay, yep.
Either one.
Yep,
And you design your project, you're coming in for a grading permit,
yep,
and you have your stormwater management computation shown there, and the
that my
volume that
site
you're.
guy has done.
Hmm?
That my site guy has done.
Yeah,
Right, okay,
yeah.
okay.
And it's stamped and sealed by an engineer saying that this is the required volume that I'm required to treat, and this is the volume that I am treating based on using these practices. And if it comes up short, the first thing I'm gonna ask is, while I'm reviewing, is why are you coming up short? Is there anything that you can do to increase it? And if it's real close and just falls short, if there's a request to have a reduction in it, I take that to David Jarrell, I go over the project with him and say this is what they're coming out as. In the time that I've been here, there has not been more than, I would say, 5 projects in 6 years that have requested that waiver. And most of the time when we do have that request for the waiver, it's where a situation when the site is disturbing less than the state requirement for square footage, and the only reason they're required to get a grading permit is for they're excavating more than 100 cubic yards of excavation and fill. And that's the only time that I've ever seen that waiver come through.
Okay,
If I
thank
could
you.
just finish the thought with the Central Park, I brought that up just to kind of show, in that situation, we have a downstream,
Yeah.
that's kind of in the headwaters, we have a downstream restoration project that the Spa Creek
Oh, yeah, it's
Conservancy
right
is
there,
doing
it's right there, yeah.
millions of dollars, and so, Yeah, I think we're putting a lot of money, well, we as a community, I should say, are putting a lot of money into that creek and that watershed. And because of the water quality concerns, they've found elevated levels of bacteria in Spa Creek. We've seen numerous algal blooms there. So I think there seems to be, in this case, should be ample cause to use the provision here in terms of water quality problems that are existing downstream. So again, that brings it back to just how do we encourage and get Public Works to kind of look at using more than the minimum. And there are alternatives in here, as Alderwoman Tierney mentioned, number 4 on this highlighted sheet is kind of, it says Public Works may develop separate policies for providing water quality treatment for redevelopment projects. Kind of lists a number of things, and I know this is getting into the policy, but do you know if Public Works has any of uses any of these other alternatives? So for your sake, it lists retrofitting existing BMP upgrade, retrofits including existing BMP upgrades, off-site ESD implementation, participation in stream restoration project, and a payment of a fee in lieu, which is something I'd like to kind of work on, because I think in the larger legislation I want to follow up with is to have, if we actually do increase the minimums in the actual legislation, we could say, well, if you have to treat 150%, that, or 125%, that whatever's over that 100%, that minimum, you need to, if you can't do it on site, or maybe we just encourage them to go off site and treat elsewhere. They could go into one of these grandfathered projects like the apartment complexes and put treatment there of some kind, be it permeable pavers or.
So to answer your question, have I seen anything like that being done? Not typically. Most of the time, the practices are met through the site with the stormwater management that's required on those sites.
Okay.
Right, but you are, Rob, touching on a very important thing. Central Park happens to be an example in another way, which is the traffic study, or lack thereof. And what the Civic Association is pointing out is there are a whole bunch of failed intersections, i.e. downstream from Central Park, that the planning department typically does not take into account. So everything is viewed as an individual isolated project in planning and zoning, and it doesn't take into account the holistic impact. And here we're talking about, in stormwater management, we're looking specifically at the project, and we're not looking downstream. And I think we've got to stop doing that, because we're going to pollute ourselves to death. We're going to traffic ourselves to death. We're going to have no parking. I mean, the city is just going to become undesirable rapidly, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we treat everything as an individual isolated project and don't look at, and I'm not saying you're doing that, but I'm worried that writ large we're not doing it. We're not looking at the overall impact. So any particular project doesn't generate more traffic than the roads will bear for that traffic. But when you have a whole bunch of other projects going on, and they're all not generating enough traffic for that particular project, but they are, with the impact of all of them, we're getting killed. We can't get in and out of our neighborhoods. So I think that's a very important point, that downstream point to bring up. But I wanted to ask some specific questions and then get into criteria, because I think that still is the bottom line. These ESDs, are they like rain gardens? Are they really permanent solutions? Do they last for a long period of time? Or do they sort of get filled in, silted up, and lose their effectiveness?
So every grading permit that we do in the city has a stormwater management maintenance agreement requirement that's attached to it. So any stormwater management that's done on the site as part of that grading permit needs to have that maintenance agreement that gets attached to the land records.
But Matt, what does that mean? I'm thinking of the street in park on 4th at Severn, the one that Jim Urban helped design. And that was requiring that the people, the businesses adjacent to it were going to come out and clean up the trash and clean
So-
it out. And I can't believe you have the time to monitor that.
So, with the, like, let's stick with grading permits that come
Right.
through, like a development or something like that. So in that development, the maintenance agreement will say, there's this many practices that need to be maintained, and it's on them to maintain them.
But if they
Which-
don't,
We are required, as part of our MS4 permit, to inspect them once every 3 years. So,
in perpetuity or just for a 5-year window?
in perpetuity.
And is that
Because we have to
done,
report
And you
that
have
to
the
the,
staff to do that?
that's part of the Green Vest contract. So,
and is that done
Yeah.
by Public Works or OEP,
that's
the inspections
Public Works, I believe.
Yeah,
currently?
OEP doesn't perform any inspections.
So, and if you don't feel comfortable answering this, no problem, but, so currently though, is there enough staff, is there staff in Public Works who,
We always
Who
could use more
inspects?
staff. You know, it's definitely, you know. it's
I
part
know
of-
that was a problem when I was working with you, is just,
Yeah,
we didn't have time to actually do all those inspections, but.
yeah, and I do bond inspections when I can, and that's part of the triannual inspections. That kind of kicks it off. There's 2 inspections that we have to do for every grading permit. So to get them closed out, we have to do a bond reduction inspection, which is when construction's complete. We go out, we look at them, make sure everything's functioning properly. If not, there's notes and corrections that are required. And then we do a bond release inspection a year after that, just to make sure that it's still functioning properly. And that's one of the biggest concerns I have with increasing the requirements for stormwater management is a lot of times we go out and look at these practices and they're failed within that first year. And it's very difficult. There's a lot of times where there's just ponding water in them. And what the cause is, I can't exactly say. I mean, that could be a construction problem. It could have been a poor design problem. It could have been a number of things that could have happened to it since the time that they started the project. It could be an area that got compacted during construction or something like that. So, you know, that's the difficult part. If you increase the requirement of stormwater management, it could be more failed practices out there.
Yeah, but see, this is, and it's really part of the reason why I asked this question. My sense is that developers come in, they meet the minimums, they make their money, they go away. And the community has to live with the aftermath of these things forevermore. And we're left holding the bag. So they put in these things, they fail. We don't have enough staff time to check on them, or we stop checking on them after a period of time and they fail. And we didn't get the stormwater management. And now it goes into our creeks and rivers and so forth, and we have to clean it up. And they're long gone with a sack full of money, and we're left holding all of the results. And it doesn't make any difference if it's stormwater, if it's traffic, if it's parking, if it's overcrowded schools, we're getting left with the bag. And I suspect my colleagues too, are getting it in the neck. And I think rightfully so from our constituents, because they're saying, you're not protecting us. You're not writing the laws that protect us. You're not giving us the staff to protect us. You're leaving us in a lurch. These guys are not permanent residents or permanently invested in Annapolis. They're permanently invested in making money and going on to the next project.
So just to not defend or, you know, be combative with your statement.
No, I don't want.
You know, what I see a lot of times when I go out and do inspections for the bonds, the biggest frustration I have is with the developers and the builders who don't follow their plans. I've had a few times where I've gone out there and let's say they were supposed to have a rain garden on one side of their property
Right.
because that's where the downspout is that feeds it. They put it on the other side where it doesn't get any runoff from the house or anything at all. It's really frustrating.
Yeah, what do we do?
We don't release their bond. We give them a chance to address
But
the
the bond-
situation, and if they don't address the situation, we'll collect the bond and we'll make it work right the way it's supposed to.
Right. So the bond ties right into another question / point, which is fee in lieu of. So in the Eastport Shopping Center, there's a requirement for 5% open space. They're allowing the developer to claim the patio of the planned restaurant as open space, and they're charging them $3,800. $3,800 for 100 units, so that's $38 per unit for 50 years. That's not a fee in lieu of, that is a joke. That is ridiculous. And again, if we're gonna require open space, I hope it's for a reason, and we're not getting it. We listen to Robert Eads sit out here all the time and talk about how when the projects are redone, there's no accounting for
No
places for the
space,
kids
yeah.
to play. And it's because the developers are getting away with murder on this stuff. They're killing us. And we're left, we the taxpayers, not only do we have to bear the burden of the cost to remediate these things, we have to pay the burden of what they're dumping on us, whether it's stormwater or traffic. And we've got to stop doing that.
The
I
other
mean,
thing
as a
too
city.
with stormwater management, and I'll tell this to everyone, and I always tell this to everyone, the dirty secret to stormwater management is maintenance. If you don't maintain this stuff, it will
Yeah,
fail over
right.
time.
That's
And-
exactly why I asked you the question about the
And what I do
ESDs.
when I do my bond inspections, I really try to make an effort to meet with the homeowners. I leave my business card, I'll write a note on the back saying, please contact me about stormwater management, I'd like to tell you what you have on your property. And I'll also inform you about the stormwater management credit program that we have.
Right.
So is that bond inspection to release the retainage? Or when do you do the bond inspection? I'm confused.
So when the life cycle of a project is,
Yeah.
it gets a grading permit, they start construction.
Yeah,
When they complete construction, they have to submit as-built as part of the project.
okay, so it is related to holding retention on
Yes,
them?
yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
So they send in the as-built
Yeah.
and have a written form of completion, and that's when it kicks in for us to do a bond inspection.
And in
But
terms of the fee, in terms of the maintenance, you're absolutely right,
Yeah.
in terms of the hidden secret. And that's what I hope we can start to address that with the Green Vest, but also what has to be a part of that is our increase to our stormwater fee. And so you may not have the answer, but do you know the status of we were presented, we received a presentation about the stormwater fee study that was
I
done.
don't have any information
Okay.
on that.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, just for my colleagues' sake, I guess, that we can get that in this year's budget.
Right.
So we can, because I
But-
think we do need to,
So
But
the
figure
rate
again,
doesn't go
The
up?
bonds
Yeah.
themselves, I remember Eastport Yacht Club badgering me that they hadn't gotten their bond. And the size of the bonds are chump change too, really. I mean, they're not.
Well, that's based on the construction cost for the site, not for the building. And that's just the way that they're,
Yeah, I know,
Yeah.
but our job is, if that's not really working effectively, maybe we need to change the code so the bond is more substantive. So if they don't do the work, we really will have some money to have the taxpayers do the remediation.
and, there's also some builders, you can't say all of them aren't doing well. There's some builders that do live in the city, and they really take a lot of pride in their projects that they do.
Yeah.
Some of them will actually increase the size of their rain gardens on the projects. And, they really want to work with us and be able to make sure that they're doing things right. So, I mean,
Those are the people who should be getting council citations, not this
Yeah.
litany,
Yeah.
your business lasted 20 years, you get a prize,
Yeah.
kind of thing.
I
Well,
noticed
but
that.
to continue
okay,
on
yeah,
this,
yeah.
this line, I'm struck by the ad, I can't remember which insurance company, but they're talking about the fact that in the last 10 years, we've had 26 500-year storms. So remediating 1 inch, and I was struck by this curve when we got the news from you, but there's more damage by big storms being done, like scouring out creeks and things like that I don't think we've even begun to think about or look at. We did the tour of the creek next to the Eastport Shopping Center, where that's all been scoured out in a combination, I think really of the post office and Watergate and the shopping center. But we're gonna have to do a substantial restoration of Jones Cove because of the scouring that has gone on. And I think that we need to be updating our thinking just as climate change has changed what is really a 500-year storm to once every 5 years. I mean, 1-inch storms are now chump change. Look what we had over the weekend.
So, just not to correct you or anything like that, with